Welcome back, everyone. It is still Thursday, February 9th, even though it feels like we've already lived the whole day. And I am grateful to be continuing this conversation on ways we can improve our reappraisal process here in Vermont, and grateful to you, Mr. Krajewski, for joining us. So,
Thank you.
floor is yours.
Thank you. My name is Bill Krajewski. I'm the owner and president of New England Municipal Consultants. We do reappraisals here in Vermont. We've been working in Vermont since about 2000, 20 odd years now. We have probably just over 30 clients, and we're one that typically carries a different CAMA system. You have a CAMA system that is predominant in this state, the NEMREX Microsolve system. And we use Patriot Properties assessment system. I was sort of interested in your previous, the individual who was testifying was from Buncombe County, and I believe that's a Patriot client, as a matter of fact. I've been an assessor in New England for about 45 years now, a little too long. I spent about 22 years in government itself. I was an assessor in Massachusetts for about 22 years before I started my own company in 2020. And I've got about 30 clients here in Vermont. We do reappraisals. We also do some assessing work where we are the actual appointed assessor in, excuse me if I can't remember the exact number, but it's between 5 and 7 communities. And we act as a pretty busy consultant in probably another 10 communities. Many of the comments that you have heard along the line about the difficulties that listers are having trying to meet deadlines, statutes, et cetera, are all too true. So my experience primarily covers New England. I've worked in Massachusetts, I've worked in New Hampshire, I've worked in Maine to some degree, and I've done a little bit of consulting in Rhode Island. And the one thing that I think that makes Vermont common with all of those states more than anything else is that we're New Englanders are town government people. I understand the discussions about counties, et cetera, but that's not the way we do things. And I listened to the individual talking about a statewide or a county-wide model and stuff, and I find it difficult to figure a path for how you'd ever get to someplace like that. But that would be something for you to decide. From my point of view, I look at New England, and I think you have two very, very good models of how a town-type assessment structure works, and that is both in Massachusetts and New Hampshire. Both, I started in Massachusetts as Massachusetts was making its entrance, so to speak, out of some very, very difficult times assessment-wise into an assessment process that works incredibly well at this point. I still have one client in Massachusetts. I've done them for 30-something years. I can't remember, and it's mostly a labor of love more than anything else. But we're required in Massachusetts to basically to reappraise or adjust values every single year. And every 5th year, the state comes in and sort of tests your statistics to make sure that you're following guidelines. And a lot of people will sit there and say, that's crazy. Taxpayers aren't going to like their values changing all the time. Not true. People get used to it. The town I work in Massachusetts has, I believe it's about 2,800 parcels. So it's a good sized community. This past year, as everybody knows, with COVID and the pandemic and everything, values went off the wall, and that happened everywhere, not just in Vermont or New England or wherever. So we had one of our largest increases we've ever seen. I think it was just over 15% overall market value change in 1 year, which is pretty substantial. Usually market values are moving 2, 3, 4%, sometimes up, sometimes down in the past. And yet we got finished with that, and we had 7 appeals that were filed. So people are very, very used to watching their values change incrementally. And I think one of the problems you will run into if you delay reappraisals too much is that you're going to watch communities fall substantially out of compliance. And when they do, the reappraisal is going to be a very, very difficult thing. When I first started here, some of the communities we worked in had not had a reappraisal for 10, 15 years sometimes, and we'd watch values double. And it's very, very difficult to explain to a taxpayer that, no, your value didn't change in 1 year. You had the same value for 20 years. Now, but, you know, I always equate it to being a car mechanic. I don't know anything about fixing a car. And a taxpayer doesn't know anything about how taxes are necessarily established. They look at last year's value and this year's value. That's the way that they look at things. So when I look at the situation in Vermont, I really see two key elements that need to be addressed if, in fact, you were to maintain a town-by-town basis. And one of them, I think you're spot on, and that's the idea of cyclical reappraisals. And I think there's two things that will happen with a cyclical reappraisal. A cyclical meaning that a town is on a schedule for every 5 years or 3 years or whatever schedule you want. But I think layered on top of that, there has to be an insistence that the town is in fact not only maintaining its properties from a permitting point of view or things that change, but also simply reviewing property on an annual basis. In New Hampshire, I think they have a 5-year cycle of re-inspections that they do. In Massachusetts, I believe it's 10 years. But the point is you're putting fresh eyes on every parcel periodically. And that's important because in many, many of the communities that I work in, and we work in communities that are tiny and communities that are relatively large. And the one thing that will drive you a little bit crazy is the permitting process is usually either non-existent, there's no zoning in the community, and we see a lot of that, or there's almost no interior permits that are out there. And that's problematic because let's look at something like Montpelier. We're doing Montpelier right now. We're finishing the reappraisal. And you have an enormous amount of old houses in town. And those houses are often rehabilitated substantially indoors. And if I don't see that the kitchen's been redone and the wiring's been redone or the furnace has been put in, then I'm not going to have a fair market value on that house because a house that's been done like that has a substantial difference from one that is original. So that, as an example, when that then falls into the state EQV study, that's going to affect my CLA, and it's affecting my CLA because it's very difficult for me to collect that information. So at least getting eyes on a house on a periodic basis, a drive-by, attempting to enter the house, maybe considering giving the towns a little bit more of an ability to enter homes, a few more tools to be able to do that. You can't force your way to house. No, I ever suggest that you do such a thing. But maybe sometimes it's a little prod saying to people, look, we're just trying to be fair to everyone. So we're asking you if you can, that would be great if you cooperate. It's really all you can do. But if we had more government saying things like that, then it might help somewhat. As I said, a cyclical reappraisal keeps us closer to 100%. There's often a lot of talk about the CLA, and I understand the issues with that. I'm going to address that in a minute. But the bigger problem from my point of view is the COD. The COD tells me that equity has fallen off, and that to me is more important. Hey, if your CLA drops to 75 and I can just raise everybody's value by 28% or something like that, there would be a net no change in tax. Everybody's value went up the same, the tax rate falls accordingly, and nothing really changes. But a COD tells you that I have inequities. That's really where the issue lies. When we sign a contract, when we work with communities, the first thing we tell them is that a CLA is something I can't control. I can't control it at all. That's the real estate market. I can't control what properties sell for in your community. But if I do a good job with your reappraisal and I judge your properties correctly, then I can control your COD. So that becomes another thing. Remembering too that with cyclical, it keeps the public, I think the more often it happens, the more people get used to it and the more they become accepting of it. I think the other thing is with a cyclical program, you're also going to increase competition amongst vendors in the state. One of the big problems you have in the state is trying to draw other vendors in. I get I don't know, 4 or 5 telephone calls a week right now about communities begging us to do a reappraisal. And my company is growing, but we have, in my estimation, a very, very good reputation in the state. And I don't want to grow beyond my means to do a good job. And that's just very simply it for the most part. So how is it that the state draws more vendors in to make the process open up? And I would suggest to you that the more vendors that get drawn in, the more it's going to control costs in the end. Because right now it's kind of almost a closed market. There's NEMREC and there's us, and there's not many other bidders out there for the most part. The other key point I think that needs to be addressed in a bill or needs to be addressed as an issue is training in the state. The state tries to do a good job. They really do. The PVNR does a wonderful job with statutes, etc. But there needs to be more of a hands-on learning how to be an assessor. I've always said when I was in Massachusetts, I've looked at, sometimes I don't know, 100,000 houses in my life I've walked into. So I've seen a lot. And that's what makes you a good appraiser, a good assessor in the end. Statutes, laws, things like that. I can look them up in a book. I don't have to learn them verbatim. So the point is that there needs to be more training that runs toward how to be an appraiser. That's not an easy thing to do. But that's where the training needs to be. A lot of times with listers, there's training toward the statutes and then a lot of training toward cost. And cost doesn't equal market. The statute says fair market value. It doesn't say fair cost value. So it's important that there's maybe a bit more push toward that. The last thing that I'd like to talk about, the next to last thing I'd like to talk about is all of the talk about the CLA. The CLA issue is more of a problem with small communities. One of our communities, one of my favorite communities we work in is Walden. Walden is a beautiful little community, but it is as tiny as it gets. It's 650 parcels. We did the reappraisal in Montpelier back in 2013, I think it was. And we got a lot of kudos for doing that. I kept saying, wow, you did such a great job over in Montpelier. I had 350 sales to work with. If I can't make a CAMA system work with 350 sales, I shouldn't be in the business. But I come into Walden and I have 18 sales over 3 years. They don't tell you much of anything. And you really, so as an example, the two most difficult things to put a value on are land. I know there was a gentleman, one of the committee members, who talked about a statewide land curve the other day. I've been in this business a long time. No such thing. You're never going to get a land curve that will work for everyone. It's not a bad idea, and it might work regionally in some cases, but it'll never work for everyone. So there's a perfect example. I'm in Walden, and I've got one lot that sells for $35,000, and then all of a sudden the lot right next to it sells for $14,000, and they're both arm's length transactions. One of them was bought by I don't know, we love to say a flatlander who didn't know better, and the other bought by someone else. But whatever it might be, they're both arm's length transactions. So I can't make a CLA stay in line when I have sales that I'm going to have the same value on both of them, but one of them sold for 35 and the other one sold for 14. I'm not going to be able to do that. And the same thing happens with mobile homes. Mobile homes, I could ask for nothing better than to throw mobile homes out of the CLA calculation. They're incredibly difficult to deal with. After they get to a certain age, banks will no longer finance them. So therefore, they're cash-only transactions. And cash-only transactions will be all over the board. And properties like that and sales like that dominate small communities. And then every once in a while, as in almost every community in Vermont, there are 2 or 3 pieces of property that are trophy properties. Somebody has a large, beautiful house that was built in the 90s with 150 acres to it. And someone comes in and spends $1.2 million on it. And the town's value on it is $435,000 or $400,000, and which wasn't necessarily a bad value. But once again, you could see how a CLA will get blown out of line. if I have 5 or 6 sales like that, even 24 sales like that in Montpelier, a COD, because it is reactive to the median sale or the median um, ratios, it's not going to be affected by those outliers mathematically. It just isn't affected. I have 300 sales and I have 16 of them that are outside with normal parameters. They're not going to push that COD around. But if I've got 14, 15, 22 sales in a community and I get 6 of them that are out to lunch, and not so much out to lunch, but hard to explain, I'm never going to be able to make a COD work. So we've done reappraisals in Walden, gosh, I think 4 times now. And I watch the COD just jump and jump and jump and jump. And yet when I look at Montpelier, their COD stayed in beautiful shape for the 10 years that between reappraisals. It started to rise, but once your COD gets to 20, 25%, really 15%. I mean, the IAAO standard is nothing above 10%. So the point very simply is when I hit 20, I'm not treating taxpayers equitably. And that's the part when I come in. So how can I do that? That's why one of the things that I've heard a certain amount of in this committee is the whole idea of regionalizing some services. And regionalizing a CLA to some extent makes a lot of sense. I mean, I can see taking a town like Walden and saying, dump it into a pool with Hardwick, dump it into a pool with Walcott, or other communities that are like that, and say, the CLA will be established for all 3 of these communities at once. Now, you can still maintain an individual CLA outside to tell a community whether it needs to reappraise or not, or what it needs to do. But they need to have some sort of protection from watching that CLA take some real nosedives and rises that really make it very difficult in communities like that to make people understand. And you almost can't to say, well, no, your value didn't change, but because the ed rate took a large jump or a large fall, this is why your tax bill changed. That's a really difficult conversation. So the idea of grouping towns together by some methodology, and I would suggest very simply, it should be by looking at historically, first of all, if you look at their CLAs and if they do gyrate a lot, then that's a potential community that should be looked at to do something like that, to make changes like that. So the point very simply is just to try to figure out a way to address issues so that smaller towns don't get crushed by their CLA, and maybe a grouping of communities by, I don't know, median sale price or by some method. There's a lot of them there. You could very easily take every community in the state and say, I'm going to give it a numeric value of 1 through 10, 10 being the most expensive communities and 1 being the most inexpensive community. And I at least set myself up a parameter to say, well, maybe this is how I group it. Now we look geographically and see whether there are groups of communities. I don't know whether that's acceptable to communities, but I think it's unacceptable for them to watch CLAs drop the way that they do. Now, the last thing that I would like to talk a little bit, we were talking about costs a bit in the last gentleman was testifying. It's hard for me to be specific about it, but I would say this to you. I'm going to use a client that I have in Massachusetts, the one I have in Massachusetts. We're required to do a reappraisal. We're required to change values every year, which is basically what the state of Vermont right now calls a statistical reappraisal. That's kind of what we do every year. And then every 5th year, you do a full-blown reappraisal. Now, in between, you've been cyclically re-inspecting and re-looking at properties again. So there's no property inspection piece of it when you do a reappraisal. But typically, when that 5th year comes around, you have to get a little more in depth with it. You've got to do more of an income approach on the commercial properties. We usually do a review. Every job we ever do, when we're all finished, we do one more drive-by in the entire community to see whether we've got things correct or not. And the cost of something like that right now is running about $16 a parcel per year. That's what it costs them in Massachusetts, about twice what you're paying right now. So that's what a typical cost is for that type of program. And I really don't think that would differ that much in Vermont. It might go a little lower than that, but I would think if you were in a cyclical program and you were, changing values every 5 years or something, it might give you some kind of an idea of what it is that you're looking at. Now, that doesn't include software changes and things like that, which is one thing from a personal point of view. I keep hearing about statewide camera systems, and all I can think of is, well, that didn't work in Vermont. You kind of gave up on it, and I understand why. And it's because of trying to maintain it. And it's about, that's just as simple. When I say maintain it, I mean support-wise. And if you look carefully, you'll see that New Hampshire attempted the same thing and gave up on it. Massachusetts attempted the same thing and gave up on it. Now, maybe they just didn't do it right. But all three of them came to the conclusion, or those two came to the conclusion, that they were better off going to the market for their camera systems and their services than they were trying to provide it from the state. One last comment that I'll make, and I will stop. One of the things that bothers me personally a lot is that when we're finished with a reappraisal in Vermont, there is no testing that's done by the state of Vermont to make sure that we've done a good job. That's not a smart thing at all. I help you issue a grand list in June. And in October, the state issues what they call the results of their three-pronged test. And the three-pronged test tells you very, very little. It truly does, compared to what it should. But the point is in October, I've already left town. I'm done. I've been paid. And now the state is telling me whether I did a good job or didn't do a good job. That doesn't make much sense. There needs to be more of a monitoring, and we do a really good job, but we should be monitored in some manner. There should be some methodology for the state to come in and say, is NEMC doing a good job here? Are they doing what they say? Are they looking at all these properties? Did they run their public hearings? When I look at your statistics, the three-pronged test is a very, very minimal test of compliance versus testing CODs, CLAs. I mean, I think one of the reasons why we do a good job is because we dive as deep as we possibly can. I want to know if I'm valuing larger houses versus smaller houses at the correct rate. So you use a statistic called a PRD, a price-related differential. We look at things like that because we're trying to determine, am I valuing you inequitably compared to other property? I want to look at older houses versus newer houses. I want to look at larger lots versus smaller lots. I want to look at all those different things. And I know this is off a little bit, but it's a private peeve of mine that I feel like I get finished with work and I have no one that tells me, you did all right. And in the end, what you need to worry about is as you grow, and if you grow in a commercial model like we currently are, you're going to have different players coming into the state, and you're going to want to know that they know how to do it correctly, and that's kind of important.
Thank you, Mr. Krajewski. You are sharing a lot of information with us, and it's all really helpful. And I'm taking some notes, and I see lots of other people taking notes. I'm wondering if, one, I want to save some time for questions with you, and two, I want to know if you can send us your remarks sometime this week so that we can have them for reference.
Sure, absolutely, I can. And I am done with my comments.
Oh, I interrupted 1 second too early.
That's all right.
Representative Maslin.
Yeah, following the chair's comment, in any format that's most helpful to you would probably be very helpful to us. I mean, bullet points work well. If you're like me, hesitant sometimes to write really long sentences when I'm trying to send information to other people. So whatever works for you is going to be useful for us. Thank you.
That'll work for me. I'm exactly the same way. I'm sort of when I hear a telephone call that's more than 30 seconds, I don't even want to listen to the back.
Thanks. Yeah.
Thank you. Sir, could you include, I think you probably have heard previous folks talk about the appeal process. I'm particularly interested. And again, for a vendor who's very proud of their work, I suspect that one of the aspects of pride is that those appeals that do happen are in a way vindicating your work. And I'm just wondering, in the tension between keeping it local and going to some other market region, how would you structure the steps that are customary in New England, from the local listers through civil authority and to some regional appellate body?
I would say this to you. First of all, the grievance process itself works correctly. I think hearing an appeal at a local level is absolutely where you need to start. I would tell you that BCAs are all over the board. I have BCAs that are very, very good at what they do. I have BCAs that have problems keeping personal issues out of it. And that's not to insult. It's very, very difficult to stand in front of or to sit in front of your neighbor and deny them or question them in some way. It's never an easy process. That's why sometimes being an assessor, as I am, in essence, we're dispassionate. And I don't mean to say we don't care, because that's not true. But the outcome is not dependent upon my friendships or whatever. I'm trying to make the correct judgment. The problems start to exist, I think, in particular with commercial property, which I think everyone knows. And that's that a lot of commercial property owners don't want to avail themselves of the state appraiser, which I don't think any community minds going to the state appraiser. That's an easy, inexpensive way to go. Present your cases. And for the most part, I feel like we get fair judgment out of it. It's what you put into it and what you do. We've had some pretty good luck, and other times not so much. The problem that exists is when commercial properties say, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to go right to Superior Court. Well, now all of a sudden I've got a small town. You can't go to court without a lawyer. And we all know, we just went through one in St. Johnsbury. We've been working on one in St. Johnsbury. And the bottom line is that you're talking about, I mean, maybe $4,000 to $5,000 in taxes over a couple of years. But that's balanced against the cost to win, if you do win, which will probably be $10,000. Well, why would you want to try or appeal something like this when it will cost me $10,000 to save? Those are the types of very difficult decisions. And Vermont's not alone in this. I mean, in Massachusetts, when I was an assessor there, it was one of the things that drove me out in the end, is that the lawyers would just, it was a sport. So it became people would, I always used to say, we got an appeal one time in Andover on a building that had become tax exempt. Why are you appealing a tax exempt building? Well, the lawyer didn't know that it had become tax exempt. Because it automatically filed things. And I don't want to start lawyer bashing here either. It's a wonderful profession, but it can get very, very difficult at different times. But so for small communities, that becomes important, because I mean, I'm sure you're as well aware of it as I am. Small communities almost never have a quote town attorney. They don't. They have someone they go to or they call when they need them, but there's no regular services, and they might have $2,000 or $3,000 at most in the budget for an attorney during the year. That's not enough to even cover the appeal. So that part of it is a problem. And I'll be honest with you, I have absolutely no idea how you solve that.
Yeah.
I'm curious about the three-prong rule. Is that something that will be covered later, or is that something?
Yeah, we can have Jill talk us through that later.
Okay.
Thank you so much for joining us. We're going to be continuing our work over here, and we'll reach back out probably as we get clearer on our path. Thank you.
Sounds good.
Really
And I'll
appreciate you joining
send
us.
I'll send that information to Sosha.
Thank you. Yes, Sorsha would appreciate that.
Thank you very much. Thank
We
you for
would
having me.
appreciate you sending it to Sorsha, actually. I don't think Sorsha has an opinion on whether or not she received it. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Clodfelter, thank you for your patience. And your patience too, Karen. Thank you. Good.
So thank you for inviting me in today. I appreciate it a lot. My name is Ed Clodfelter. I'm the senior appraiser for NEMLIC, New England Municipal Resource Center. You heard a lot about us already today. We do a lot of work in the state of Vermont, and we have for over 35 years. So that's why people know who we are. Just to cover sort of my background and experience, it sort of ties into what people have been talking about. I'm probably the person that's been around here the longest. I started off at property valuation review, and I was a systems specialist for PVR for 8 years. And back in the old, when we had a statewide system back in those days, the old CAPSTAT system, that's what I ran. And I did all the equalization studies, and I did all the current use programming and things like that for PVR. So I've been around here for a little bit. Excuse me, get a glass of water. And then I broke away and started my own business for 20 years doing reappraisals. For a short stint in between there, I worked for a company called Sigma Systems Technology. And they were a really big software company, valuation company that worked all over North America. And for them, I did system development training. Sigma had the statewide system in Massachusetts, for example, that Bill alluded to earlier, that is no longer in place there. So I worked from Yakima to Knoxville to Charleston, South Carolina to Winnipeg to every place in between. So I have a little bit of the large county jurisdiction experience, and I've seen what they go through in dealing with that. Again, my reappraisal company for 20 years and just dealing with towns in Vermont, although I did consulting in Delaware a little bit as well. And then the last 10 years, I've been the senior appraiser for a New England Municipal Resource Center. Now, I have a slide later on here that I talk about that through 2026, we'll have done over 106 reappraisals in the state of Vermont. So we've done a lot. And so hopefully I can sort of tap into what your concerns and questions are. I have probably some experience related to all those things. As I was going through the legislation and the testimony, some things came to mind. And so I've got sort of 4 recommendations that I want to go through and then give you what in terms of the sort of the global numbers of things that to be considered. And the first thing we'll just deal with, this crisis we have in terms of towns falling outside the boundaries, the triggers, if you will, for the common levels in the COD. And I'll just reiterate again what Bill said, is the CLA is a really nice number to talk about. The one you really have to be concerned about is coefficient dispersion. That's the one that really tells you where you're at. You can fix a CLA second. You can't fix a COD without putting boots on the ground. There's no other way around it. There just isn't. So 63% of the towns, fell under this order. And so it really created sort of a statutory crisis is really what it is. I mean, if the legislation changes, that sort of goes away. It doesn't get towns reappraised any faster or less, but that portion of it does, that portion of the crisis does go away. And because we've had the sort of triggers to deal with the reappraisals, it's created some situations. We know that towns will delay doing reappraisal until they get put under orders. That is actually my watch.
Great.
Is that good technology?
It's a moment where we all think it's in our own heads.
Yeah, I know. And I can't seem to get rid of it. It'll stop in just a second. I don't know how many times I've heard towns say that, well, the select board is just not going to approve us to do a appraisal until we get put under orders. And, we have right now 13 towns that haven't done a reappraisal in 16 years. I just finished a reappraisal in Milton. You did? And, they hadn't had a reappraisal in 16 years. And that's just, it's just way too long. And what happens from that is it creates a big swing in terms of the values. About in 2020, we had a reporter got a hold of me from some project that a town that he was working in. I wish I could get that off. I'm sorry.
Give it to Scott. Sorry, Scott.
It's worth the face.
So the reporter calls me and says, well, it was the town we were doing a reappraisal in, and he says, well, values went up 40%. And, people like excited and up in arms about it. Said, he says, what's your reaction to that? I said, when was the last reappraisal? I said, 15 years ago. He said, well, what do you expect? It's just way too long. You can't go that long time frame. But what happens is they delayed doing the reappraisals. There's been this huge fluctuation in terms of values, and their grand list gets out of whack. They haven't had any inspections over that time period on a consistent basis. So the COD starts to spread even bigger. And that becomes a much, much bigger problem to deal with things. I've read all the statistics for you and stuff. I broke some of these things out. 13% of the property of the towns have a COD greater than 20. 26% have a COA less than 85. 27% have both a COD and a COA problem. So there's a lot. 40% of the towns have a COD over 20. That's significant. That really is a lot of properties. 53% have a COA less than 85. And I'm going to tell you one little thing that you may not want to hear, but a few years ago, we changed the legislation to went from 80% common level, went up to 85. Well, 30% of the towns that are under orders fall into that category. I'm not saying it wouldn't happen eventually, it would have. But that little gap right there really created part of the problem, to tell you the truth. So my first recommendation, and you've already heard this from everybody, that we need to get rid of the COD, CLA triggers, if you will, and because it's sort of delaying reappraisals. And I just think it's the wrong way to approach. The CLA and the COD give us really good information. It probably shouldn't be a mandate requirement. That's my first recommendation.
It shouldn't be a mandate.
It should not be a mandate requirement that you have to go to reappraisal if you fall outside the triggers.
Oh.
It gives us good information. I don't think that's the way that we need to approach this. We are getting reappraisals done in the state of Vermont. We did 16 last year. We did 8 of those, by the way. And 38% of the towns have reappraised in the last 6 years. So it's not something that towns haven't been aware of. They are working their way through slowly. But we still have those 36% of the towns haven't completed a reappraisal in the last 10 years. That's just, again, way too long. So my second recommendation from all this is that we need to create this, I think, a realistic cycle in terms of how to complete projects. I don't know what the best answer is. I think we have John Valenti maybe talking with you later on. John and I are friends, and we talked about this a little bit. But I'm going to give you a couple, 3 from my perspective. Even back in my PVR days, about 35, 40 years ago, where I ran that statewide system, I really felt at the time that I thought we really need to deal with a 10-year cycle, a full-blown reinspection, reappraisals, and do an update within 5 years. And an update from my perspective is we aren't going to do feet on the ground, go inspect and measure every property, but we're going to do statistical somewhat, if you want to call it that phrase, and just update the values and then make sure that there's some equity there. The cost is a lot less. Over the 10-year period, we could sort of deal with that. I think somebody suggested that earlier. I'm going to tell you, we also work in Washington State. We have 2 counties that we work in out there, provide software for, and I do training with them as well. And they have an interesting approach. They do updates and values every year, but it's a 6-year inspection cycle. So by the end of 6 years, they will have inspected all the properties in their county, and it's a county government to deal with that stuff. They don't have all this fluctuation. They don't have a lot of appeals because the people know what the market is. So I'm just throwing that out there as something that's at least another state is possibly dealing with. Would you be a little cautious about considering or do comparisons between Vermont and states out west? I've worked out west. We're not the same. We just are not the same. The scale is different. The types of properties are different. The scope is different. It's just not the same animal. That structure and philosophy will not work here. I can just tell you. If we're going to make some sorts of changes in terms of going to some sort of a cycle and want to implement reappraisals on some other way, I think we need to phase that in. to impose an abrupt change is going to be difficult for a lot of towns to deal with. And if you look at the slide that I have here, in the last, from 2012 to 2022, we did 56 reappraisals. So we anticipated this change was going to be coming up and started staffing up and gearing up for it. And now for 2023, we're going to be doing 10 for 2023. It's 11,000 parcels. And they're from small towns to large towns. Last year, we did Buell's Gore, all 24 parcels. It didn't take real long, but we did it. And we did Milton, which was 4,400 parcels. And that was a big, big job. And it was a very complex job. And again, one that hadn't been completed in 16 years. So the values went up significantly, no doubt about it. They sure did. But I will say from that, though, we only had 98 grievances out of 4,400 properties after 16 years. That's not bad. Yeah. And 16 of those are from one person. So we felt coming out of that pretty pleased with the product that they got out of that.
And we only had 8 all the way to the
We
end.
had go to BCA, and then we stopped right there. And 2 of those only stayed because I told them to stay.
Yeah.
I mean, they wanted to drop out, and I said, no, you should stick around. So, but we worked pretty hard at it. We met with people, we talked with people, but people were aware of what's going on. It wasn't like it was a big secret to them. So full reappraisals sort of take a couple of years to deal with, especially if you're doing, from our perspective, multiple towns at the same time. But you could do an update within a year. So I think that's the thing I wish that we would move more towards. If PVR were allowed to let these towns do updates, typically in the past, they had sort of not a hard but 5-year time frame. If some of those could extend out to 7 years, for example, I think a lot, even, Bill would agree, I think that we could probably do more of those faster and work our way through this listing that we have to deal with.
Ask you
You can.
about those numbers of appraisals that you're planning for future years. Is that, are those contracted jobs or is that just your capacity?
Now, we have actually 40 contracts for 2024, 25, and 26. I got 3 phone calls yesterday. I've got probably another 10 proposals out there. Of those 10, I'm going to get 5 of them. So we're going to be at 45 contracts. We're probably I suspect within a month over the next 3 years. So we're already out there in terms of what we're going to be doing
45 in Vermont or 45?
In Vermont.
Including all the states that you're working
in
in?
Vermont. Yeah, over 3 years. Like I said, we've seen this coming. It's not news to us and it's not news to you. And we're sort of staffed up to deal with that a little bit. I'll probably look for some more people. I'm going to jump ahead here a little bit, and I'll just tell you that you don't pick somebody off the street to do this work. It takes, when I teach a class on for listers, what I tell them is that in 3 years, you might know what questions to ask. And before that, it's like over their heads. They have no idea what we're talking about. It's not that simple. It's not that hard to, you can take a tape measure and measure a house. You can get the square footage of that, but then there's a lot of things to think about. And that's where all the camera systems come into play and the understanding of what the markets are I will tell you, within any individual given town. I live in Calais. And there's the Maple Corner western side of Calais, which I'll tell you is very different from the East Calais side. And then we have 4 lakes to deal with, and they aren't the same set of values. And, Janet Ansell used to be in this committee. Well, we both live on the old West Church Road. Well, that's different from Duger Brook. That's just within one town. To think that you're going to take one system and value all those areas that are distinctive within those towns, it's not going to happen. They could think about Woodstock, South Woodstock, Woodstock proper, the village, Woodstock and the surrounding areas. When I did Woodstock, I have 6 different land schedules within the town of Woodstock and 4 within the commercial sections. One system of trying to apply it across to everybody within even that sort of a town. One land schedule just doesn't work. We have 2 or 3 things we have to deal with in terms of Milton. Same thing. It's complex. It's hard to deal with. So I wish it were easier. I wish it were. It kind of leads me into my 4th little point here, that we got to be cognizant of the scale of things in Vermont. 49 towns are less than 500 parcels. A lot of small towns. The average parcel size is 1,285 parcels. We have, 59% of the towns are 1,000 parcels and less. Now, Bill and I can go out and do those reappraisals in those towns, but the really large reappraisal companies, they don't want to come in and deal with Searsburg at 123 parcels. There's no reason for them to deal with all that. So I do think that we had this discussion about economy of scale. There is some incentive, I think, to take, if you could get multiple towns to go together and put them together. We did Fairfax last year, same time we were doing Milton. Worked out well for us. But I would tell you that they are very different markets. They are not the same. But I'm working with doing Starks. We could do Starksboro, and you could do, Lincoln, and you could do Huntington, that sort of area, and maybe even Bristol. When you get into Middlebury, it's not the same. It's a different place. It really, truly is. Other thing, go ahead.
I have a question on that.
Yeah.
When you're grouping towns, or if you're grouping towns and you have that Middlebury different from the other, why is that a particular issue? Is that because the assessor who's going there doesn't understand the difference between the markets?
Yeah, it really is a difference in the market, so the lot values in Middlebury may be a half acre at $150,000. And that's not going to be true in Starksboro.
But why does that make it more difficult to do the assessment?
You can physically collect the data, but it's really difficult to differentiate the value. And,
okay.
And I will tell you that when I work in the Northeast Kingdom, you can take a lot of those towns and work them together. And I will certainly look at land sales across 7 or 8 towns up there. But if you're looking at land sales, we're doing in Charlotte, land sales in Charlotte, which will be very, very different than what they're going to be in Starksboro.
So it's when you're doing, when you're comparing properties to
Yeah.
do the appraisal.
And then what am I going to use to set my base with and do my comparables from?
Okay.
You have to make significant adjustments for those things. Somebody made a comment earlier, I don't know who it was, and if they were listening, I apologize this. But looking at sales over 5 years, unless you time adjust the sales, that will not work. We've been time adjusting our sales for the last 3 years. We're talking a 3-year-old sale has to go up 30-40% to make it current to today's marketplace. That's significant. Is that going to change a little bit? I think it's going to cool a little bit, but like I heard you say earlier, the number of transactions we're seeing is down, but I'm not seeing a change in the values right now. We're already 10% low. I hate to tell you that. We're 10% low in Milton already.
Yeah.
In 8 months, the market has not come down. The number of transactions has stopped. Okay. Yeah, it's incredible. It really is.
Can you help me understand the difference between like what you need to do to understand the character of different sides of a road in Calais? And like how you balance that out with sort of like the bias that we're all carrying around about the various neighborhoods where we live, and like how that sort of plays out when you're doing this work.
You really have to look at the sales. And a town the size of Calais probably has barely enough to make some educated judgments. But I'm going to look at towns in Worcester, and I'm going to look in East Montpelier and get a sort of feel for what those are. I just had an over property nearby that sold for what I thought was a lot of money. And it didn't really make sense to me, but you got to trust what the market's telling you about things. You really do. And
And so you're saying that you look across multiple towns?
I do.
in order to balance that out?
I do.
Okay, and so you're doing this sort of at a scale, whether you're hired at that scale or not, you're always thinking at that.
You have to look at it that way.
Thank you.
If you're working in Buell's Gore, there were 0 sales.
Yes.
So I looked at the sales in Lincoln and Huntington and Sparksboro to make that sort of work out.
We just have a couple more minutes left with you, so I want to make sure that.
I thought I had an hour. I guess some last quick points there then. An issue that I have is in terms of the timing for this stuff. I think it's important to mention this. So April 1st is the due date, and then we have to have our grand list lodged by June 4th for the small towns, then for June 24th for the big towns, and 2 weeks later, we start grievance hearings. And then for a lot of those towns, they start doing their tax bills in July. I don't think there's enough time to deal with all that stuff a lot of time. And then there's some restrictions that the state has to deal with. Bill talked about the 3-prong test, and also just in terms of determining the education CLA. So that time frame sort of bumps into their ability to really do that work. And I haven't heard anybody talk about this, but I think we need to change the assessment date to January 1st. We're getting grand list in June, and they're determining budgets in March. I think there's a problem there. If you think about that a little bit, I just think that there is. Finally, some quick thoughts to sort of wind down. The crisis will work its way out in 5 to 7 years. It will. We do need to make some changes in terms of how we deal with our assessments. It takes years to train an assessor. If we make requirements stricter for listers and assessors, you're going to have fewer listers and assessors to do the work. I think we have to be cognizant of that. I think you need to be mindful of local control. That you'll get some pushback from some of those small towns. They're just aren't going to like it. If you want to have conversations about CAM assistance, please invite me back. I probably have done more of those than probably anybody that we've talked with today about those. And I did a sort of a last minute little chart here. Take a look at that. And I just said, let's pretend we're going to do all the parcels in the state of Vermont in 5 years. What's it going to take? So I have to analyze in terms of the staff requirements, the productivity requirements. And if we're going to do, if we take 1,000 days over a 5-year time frame, and there are 1,300, but you can't fill them all in, and we're looking at production at doing 10 parcels a day, you need 32 appraisers to go out and inspect all those properties. And that's significant. If you can find 32 people, I would take them today. If you can find them, we'll take it.
That's the same number around the same number that Joe Turner came up with.
Yeah, it's not, it's a pretty standard sort of look at how you do things. If we were doing $100 a parcel, and there's some higher, there's some lower, you're looking at $32 million over that 5-year time frame at about $6.5 million a year. If you're doing an update, which is not in full inspections, you're probably talking somewhere about $3.9 million at $60 a parcel. And right now, we're paying out to the towns at $8.50 a parcel, we're paying out $2.8 million. So the cost is going to go up. And I guess I disagree with Joe a little bit. I don't think you're going to save money by going to a statewide system. You're just not. And there's a reason that, like Bill said, there is a reason why Massachusetts and New Hampshire started that and gave it up.
Yep.
Did those 2 states, I wasn't clear whether they stopped because they were writing their own software.
They were not.
Or because they were pulling, okay.
They were not running. I was with the company, they wrote the software. Right. So, we had that contract in Massachusetts. I did a lot of training and work down there back in my old Sigma system day. And I just think that they didn't feel it represented the towns fairly. I think we're a little bit unique. And I think a better model for us is probably Massachusetts. I think Connecticut, John will talk about that when you get him in here with that. We do have small towns. We do have smaller jurisdictions. We weren't set up to deal with county governments as they are out west. I don't think it'll work for us. I think they realized that in those towns.
But they were using off-the-shelf software or?
Well, it was actually custom made for them. It was custom designed.
By a third party?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it.
What counties do you have out in Washington? Sorry.
No, go ahead, Scott.
What counties do you have out in Washington?
Down on Snake River.
Karen, thank you. Last but not least.
Well, thank you very much for having me. Karen Horn with the League of Cities and Towns. Usually I'm quite happy to do mop-up, but I think this topic is far more complex than a lot of issues that we talk about.
And there's no need to say anything summative. This is not the end of the conversation.
Good.
Yes.
I'll say about that. So I did go to the VALA meeting yesterday virtually with Jill, and it was a really good conversation. They covered a lot of these kinds of issues. I think the upshot of that and the conversations that we've had with local officials around this issue, the moratorium, I know there are differences of opinion about this, but the moratorium on essentially assessing any kinds of penalties for not having done your reassessment. I think we're in your reappraisal. We're in that situation already. And I think that's a recognition of the current reality that would be helpful to make clear in the statute. We've supported the move to a schedule. I think that what you heard today was pretty much consensus on that issue. Don't do away with the CLA. I guess you can't do away with the COD, but because that's, I don't know, from heaven that happens or something. But move to a schedule so it's predictable, so that people know when they're going to be up. I think there was quite a bit of reluctance around the idea of going to one statewide appraisal, that would just be a bridge too far. It might cost more money. It would be hard to find the people to do the work, all the things that you've heard this morning. So that's sort of where we are right now. And again, I thank you for wading into this conversation. It's necessary, it has to happen. And we do need to make some changes, but not maybe quite as many changes as are contemplated in that draft legislation. And that's about it.
As you probably heard, I'm really interested in the appeal steps, and I think I'm hearing that at least for one, possibly two, that ought to remain as local as possible. But the other question I keep hearing people suggesting is grouping communities, if for no other reason, at least for the scheduled reappraisal process, and keeping some competition amongst operators in the regions. I threw out labor market area. I think counties are off the table for a variety of reasons that have already been explored. If you have, and your organization has an idea as to how to group these, that's appropriate for the task at hand. That is, reflect some kind of market differential. Mm-hmm. Whether it's labor market or not, I just threw that out because it already exists in the overall scheme of thing, or planning district or something, so that we know we're moving in some regional direction that you could.
Right. Well,
tell communities here's where you're probably going to land.
Yeah, we initially thought it would be if you move to a schedule. And you might be able to group towns geographically, or as several people said this morning, you might group them because they're similar markets, or you might group them according to school district, which I will mention that towns can already do that under the, and I don't believe anybody has. But there's, I don't know that we would have. At this point, we don't have a good answer for what would be the best way to group those towns. But if you did, even if you just said, like, these 50 towns are going to reappraise in 2027, they might group themselves. Because as you're hearing, the very small communities aren't going to be able to get those contracts individually.
I was going to say, in your opinion, if we said, if you cannot agree amongst yourselves, we'll decide for you, but we encourage you to,
Well, that would be a strong incentive.
yeah.
I mean, again, the last time we did that, it was a nightmare in
Yeah.
my region. And so I'm not interested in duplicating a nightmare that I have such a recent memory of.
Well,
But yes, I am curious, like, even when people say geographic, like grouping things geographically, I have no idea what that means.
right.
What does that mean?
Maybe they're the 40 contiguous towns. Maybe it's one county. I mean, because we do have lines on a map that say what a county is.
Do.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Maybe it's regional development corporations. I don't know.
Yeah.
We do have catchment areas for instance, the regional career centers, labor market lines. I mean, it's not just counties, it's out there in use already, regional planning districts.
There are agency
Yeah, yeah.
services. I mean, that's the thing. There are
Yeah.
dozens and dozens of ways we group the almost identical collection of towns. And so, and there's pros and cons of each of them. So I was just.
And so to that point, you might not want to create an additional one.
So just want to sort of check my understanding. I think when we're talking about grouping towns, we're talking about who and when would go through the reappraisal process.
Yeah.
And that doesn't obligate assessors to do that in a particular way. Like, I think we've heard a lot about how there's all this really complex, important local knowledge about this street versus that street and this market versus that market. And I just wanted to, like, folks would still have the flexibility to do the assessment using all of that knowledge and comparing to either towns that are or aren't in that collection of towns that we'd be assessing. We're just saying, on this schedule, everyone needs to be looked at more regularly, so we don't end up with 16 years later, we haven't.
Right. And you'd have an obligation within so many years, maybe 8 years. Like if you're doing 16 appraisals a year and you take 247 towns, I think you said it was 8 years last time I was here. The number of towns that would need to reappraise in order to keep that sort of number of reappraisals going. And one of the other questions that was raised yesterday is what would be, if you went to something like a statewide reappraisal or even obligating people to do it with a single appraiser in certain groups, what is the role of the local officials, the local listers and assessors for maintaining and keeping that routine up in between reappraisals? So I think that's something that we need to talk about also. And just lastly, I think, our sort of sense of the office of the lister is that it's getting harder and harder to find people to come in as other folks are retiring. And what you're going to see is more and more towns going to an assessor, some kind of paid position that fills that role, because you're just not going to find the listers. Or as years ago, somebody said to me, the listeners.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
So much. So we have like 10 minutes left. I think my preference, I think, would be to not have Jill and Abby come up and talk us through anything at this point with 10 minutes left. That seems like a foolhardy notion.
Especially 7 minutes before.
Yes.
That's like me.
So I think we will pick up this conversation next as a really walking through the legislative language a little bit more and making some decisions as a committee based on what we heard. And then we'll have witnesses and again after we do sort of another run through. So be thinking about sort of the language we have and changes we've made and See everyone at 1 o'clock back in here.
1:15.